I am excited to be joined today by Matt Moon and Heather Owens from Narrative Strategies to discuss today research, insights, and informing your public affairs strategy. My name is Teresa Hebert, and I'm the Director of Communications at Quorum. A few housekeeping items before we dive in. For those of you who joined right on time heard this a bit already, but we're using a new system now called Goldcast. And the big things that we want you to know is all on your right-hand side. You can chat throughout our session today, submit Q&A in the Q&A section, as well as find our slides today in the Docs tab. We are going to be doing a whole Q&A session at the end of the slides, so feel free to throw those in as you have them, and we'll be making our way through. We also are recording today, and we'll be sharing this out after the session. So if you have to drop off or you're just learning so much that you want to share with your colleagues, that will be available to you. Now to introduce our speakers. Today we have Matt Moon, the Managing Director at Narrative Strategies, with nearly 2 decades of experience working at the intersection of political advocacy and policy development on behalf of America's business community, corporations in multiple sectors, as well as elected officials. A veteran of both private sector policy and political campaigns, Matt has served as a public affairs and competitive intelligence strategist on political campaign committees, Capitol Hill, and leading trade associations. Heather Owens leads the firm's research practice as a senior director and specializes in solving complex challenges, managing risk, and performing due diligence on behalf of Narrative Strategies clients. Prior to joining Narrative Strategies, Heather served as research director at the Democratic Governors Association, where she built the organization's research department from the ground up and transformed the operation into an industry powerhouse. So thank you so much again for joining us, and I will kick it over to Matt.
Hey, thanks so much, Teresa, and thanks to Quorum for inviting us and for you all in joining this webinar. Heather and I are really excited to talk about research and insights and sort of our political experiences, as well as how it can all be applied into public affairs strategy. Before I turn it over to Heather for the first part of the presentation, I'll just let you know that we over here at Narrative Strategies are a bipartisan firm. There are plenty of campaigns between the two of us that we have worked in Democratic and Republican politics. There's probably been some pain Heather has caused my candidates in the past, and there's probably some pain, maybe a little bit less, for some of the candidates Heather has worked for. So you know that you're going to get sort of the nonpartisan view of how, as well as a bipartisan view on how all of this can be applied to really important public policy and public affairs campaigns. But with that, I will turn it over to Heather.
Thanks so much, Matt. I'm excited to have recently joined Narrative to apply these incredibly useful tactics to public affairs campaigns, which Matt will help focus on later in the presentation. We are here today to talk about research, as in strategic information gathering and analysis as the basis of messaging. This differs from other research items, including polling, market research, or academic or think tank research white papers. So just wanted to make sure I am not a pollster. I'm a political researcher. Every prominent political campaign engages in research both on the opposition and on themselves to identify vulnerabilities and have the most effective proof points to resonate with their target audience. Public affairs and government relations campaigns stand to benefit from this rigorous process. Research is often used to imply some kind of nefarious activity or dirty tricks. Much like lawyers preparing for trial, researchers use provable facts to build a case to present to your audience about why this is the strongest. Indulging in smear campaigns based on innuendo and rumors makes you an untrustworthy source to your stakeholders and harms your relationship with reporters. Understood this way, effective research is less about finding damaging silver bullets than it is about proactively developing issues and documented materials that help you bolster your argument and draw sharp contrasts in comparison with an opposing view. In essence, research is the process by which you find the nuggets of information to help build and support a campaign's core message. One of the ways that we do this is through a message box or a message grid. Campaigns are in large part about control. We try to control the message, control the news cycle, control the parameters of the public dialogue. Research is one of the most important tools a campaign uses to gain and keep control. Often we would prefer to focus on our own positive talking points, but rarely does our position exist in a vacuum. And using a message box exercise is great practice to help define your strategy. So the first box that we focus on is the us on us, right? What are we saying about ourselves? Where we paint a brief but compelling picture about the vision that we stand for. Campaigns without a strong core that drives everyone on the team will face adversity at the first test. Research should provide creative suggestions that bolster the talking points derived from this box. Then I usually think about the them on them, what our opponents say about themselves there in the bottom right. What is the other side saying about themselves and their position and plan? What is their call to action or their solution? If you don't feel the opponent's arguments are legitimate, you won't take the time to deeply understand them. Your counter arguments then ring hollow and fail to reach or convince those all-important persuadable target audiences. Then I think about us on them, what we say about our opposition there in the top right. This is how we undercut their value statements about the merits of their position and helps us to pivot back to the issues that we care about. This is what most people think about when they think about research. How are we going to beat them? But to be honest, it's really one part of the pie. Then there's the them on us, which is difficult to get a lot of candidates to find as a really important piece of the pie, but it is. Putting yourselves in the shoes of your opponent can help a simplified view of your talking points or tactics that might undermine your campaign. Maybe someone at your organization didn't realize that information was public, or combining innocuous information together would show an unflattering perception. Done early research will inform your campaign's communication strategy from the beginning. Done correctly, it will help you to win the fight each day as the campaign gets down to the wire. A campaign seen as controlling the narrative is on offense, talking about what it wants, when it wants. A campaign that might be described as having lost control of the narrative has been forced by the opponent to talk about what it doesn't want to talk about. Campaigns have a plan for their desired narrative arc, but it's ultimately the chess match of messaging that defines the actual shape of the narrative arc as the race unfolds. How do you avoid being publicly backed into a corner? Knowing your vulnerabilities ahead of time. So we are launching the deep dive. We have decided to do research. What do we need to think about? One of the tenets of American democracy is the idea of open and accountable government institutions. This is what allows the American people and competing branches of government to keep tabs on their elected and unelected officials. It keeps policy decision-making transparent and allows for vigorous public debate. The press is the primary vehicle for that openness and provides a venue for public debate. Much of the information the press relies on is also available to the average citizens, but most don't know that it exists. The amount of publicly available information in this country is astounding. Everything from local property tax records, court proceedings, who is giving money to a candidate, to internal government documents are available to the public. Almost every industry in this country is regulated by one or more entities on the local, state, or federal levels, and much of that information is public as well. The information needs to be related to your goals, but sometimes a helpful detail can come from an uncommon source. Knowing where to look, knowing what you are looking at, and knowing how it fits into the news story you are telling is the difference between someone doing a Google search and a master researcher. In practice, I work with a client to identify a concern, which might be a vocal opponent, something they don't know, or maybe a proposed future action. Then I identify all sources of public information that might provide insight, and we collect and analyze that information. We build the haystack. In the analysis process, we identify patterns, we see actions or data points that don't fit that pattern. Maybe it's something that we weren't even thinking about in our goals, but something that we identified as we were going through the process. We put those data points together to tell the story that we want to tell, or anticipating a story that an opponent will tell about us. And that new insight is your strategic research and becomes your pitch. Some things to keep in mind as you go about researching: reliable sources. This is important both for accuracy, but for the trust of your stakeholders as well. If a news article vaguely discusses a primary source document, try to get that source yourself so you're both confident of its findings and have material to provide to a reporter if helpful. Political TV ads do not require on-screen citations. We do it to bolster the argument of the audio, video, and on-screen text. The idea of recreating the work. If an ally is facing the same challenge, maybe ask how far down the road they are in how to approach this challenge. In political research, we collaborate between party committees constantly. The amount of time that I think about research projects with the variables of time, methodology, and money. If you need an answer in 3 days and it requires a deep scope to evaluate, it's obviously going to be a more expensive project. If you have a small budget and do a really thorough look at one aspect of a problem to see if those strategic resites are valuable to the team, there are different ways to balance looking at each of those 3 variables. Effective research tools. Research can be a lengthy process of sometimes analyzing thousands and thousands of documents or information sources to create a few pages of strategic messaging points. Most political researchers use databases like LexisNexis, which allows for searches of news articles going back sometimes decades for specific search terms. The paid databases also include federal and state court records, regulatory filings, a place that allows you to aggregate this material in a simple way. TV capturing paid databases like a TVI's or an IQ Media or plenty of others allow researchers to review databases of primarily network and cable news to quickly push out clips of supporters or validators in real time. An important tenet of democracy is often summarized as sunshine is the best disinfectant. And so sunshine laws, as they are sometimes known, and more commonly in DC as the Freedom of Information Act, allows access by any member of the public to a great deal of information about elected officials and government employees or government records. Curious if your opponent regularly emails with the governor's chief of staff? You literally just need to ask. So what effective research products should be answering? The first one that we're going to talk about brings us back to the message box. What are your vulnerabilities versus your opponent's vulnerabilities? What is your opponent's message? Do you have a response? That's really taking a step back from where you really do want to be focusing your time and looking at the entire landscape of how this is going to play out. The second one gets us back to recreating work and invites research on strategic and coalition building, right? What strategies or tactics have your stakeholders or competitors used? There's no need to reinvent the wheel, and oftentimes research can really help hone in on what has been effective for others in the space in the past. The third invites the question, why does the decision maker care in who benefits or is harmed by the issue at hand? Why are these people or industries important to a stakeholder? What data trends or news coverage or public testimony can a researcher pull together to help that story be more persuasive? Research at the end of the day is not a collection of information. It provides the map of where your position is strongest and hopefully prevents your team from being caught off guard. Matt?
So one thing before I continue on with the rest of this presentation is something that I want to reiterate that Heather said at the very beginning, which is that with our experience in politics, every high-level political campaign engages in this type of research up front to inform their strategy throughout the entirety of the campaign. In my experience in public policy advocacy, public affairs, working for trade associations, different coalitions, having clients in all sorts of industry spaces, it's been my experience that there have actually been very few public affairs campaigns that have engaged in this type of research. And so I think what Heather has shown here is that there are just sort of a lot of tools, a lot of processes, and a lot of strategies that just aren't being in my opinion, utilized by a lot of the public affairs community here in DC. The way I like to look at it is like just looking back at my experience with previous public affairs campaigns that I've both run and sort of seen from afar. What I've seen from ineffective losing public affairs campaigns is that there's no consistent message, no consistent theme. They're always playing whack-a-mole with the opposition, just the opposition coming after them with attack after attack after attack, and these public affairs campaigns having to respond to every attack without getting back on what should be a consistent message. And they're slow to adjust to what current events or the current political environment is and how it changes over time in order to make sure that they maximize the messages that they have and the assets that they've built to different environments as those times change. On the other hand, the way I've seen effective and winning public policy campaigns work is that they have very specific messages from the very beginning to very specific audiences, which might seem, obvious to you, but that's all really informed by research. There is a consistent rapid response beat to whatever news is breaking or whatever opposing views get out. But research is not only about communications. Research can also give you a guide to not only who your opponent's stakeholders are, but the allies that you can build. And I've seen research used in ways where you can gain more allies along the way, the more you learn about how different public policy issues are being discussed. So what's the common theme between ineffective versus effective winning campaigns? It's research and insights. At the end of the day, so the losing public policy campaigns that we've seen really lacked the foundational and ongoing information gathering that they needed to do from the very beginning to inform their strategy throughout the campaign. But effective campaigns did the research ahead of time to make sure, as Heather put it in her message grid, what our talking points should be, what the opposing talking points will be, but what the contrasts are going to be between the two sides of any public policy issue, but especially the part of the message grid of being prepared for what the opponents are going to say about you. So I thought it'd be good to put together sort of three basic nameless, faceless case studies on what a research can be produced in different types of public affairs campaigns and how that research can be applied. Let's say you want to build a coalition to defeat a proposed regulation because there's some federal agency out there that has proposed a new regulation that's really harmful to the bottom line of your industry, and it's a steep uphill climb to make sure that regulation isn't ultimately promulgated, right? A couple good research products coming out of this before you launch a public affairs campaign is creating, for instance, a stakeholder map of who influences that agency's leadership and staff, and also who influences those influencers. A lot of this is sort of put together haphazardly. In most public affairs campaigns I've seen, the best public affairs campaigns I've seen has the stakeholder map in front, at the very front of their strategic document to say, these are the people who we're after, these are the people who can influence them, and these are the messages that we deliver to those influencers. Oftentimes, the way to find influencers and the best messages is to do an analysis of submitted public comments. Oftentimes, when a regulation is proposed, obviously per Federal Register rules, there is anywhere between a 60 to 90-day comment period. And what we've done for our clients over here at Narrative is do a really deep dive into who submitted those public comments, what the opposition's messaging theme should be, what the allies' message theme should be, but also get a sense of how the opposition is going to shape their message through those public comments. But we've also used used research into the specific organizations and individuals who have submitted those public comments to identify third-party allies or even partners to put together a larger than what you thought would be a small coalition. So how that research gets applied is sort of, used to refine targets for that message, whether it be through paid or earned media. But as I said, recruiting those allies and making sure that you have a full understanding of what those opposition themes are. The second nameless, faceless case study is sort of the classic sort of positive public affairs campaign, right? Your industry or your company is wants to announce a new investment that they're making thanks to a certain bill or a certain tax credit that you want buy-in from lawmakers, from the classic positive campaign. I can't tell you how many times I've seen classic positive campaigns turn not necessarily into disaster, but things that come as unexpected because they didn't do the vulnerability study that they needed to on their company, on their product, and on their industry. We have seen companies fail for instance, in putting together a program to pass a piece of state legislation that would have been important to their investment in a particular thing that they wanted to do in that state. And that's because they weren't aware of the vulnerabilities of what the possible opposition viewpoints and growing grassroots movements might be. So a vulnerability study is not only about what the opposition will say, but also what the opposition has historically done to disrupt what are positive campaigns about investments that different industries and different companies make. But research is not just about public affairs, right? And I think that some of the best government relations operations and some of the best both in-house and contract lobbyists have paired together with folks in public affairs, whether in-house or out of house, to make sure that they put together what I like to call tactical policymaker profiles. And so while sort of vulnerability studies, opposition research books, those sort of stuff can help prepare a communications operations for any sort of rapid response to opposition attacks, research is not just for the communications operation. It can be used, throughout the staff of a trade association or the Washington office of a company, especially when it comes to arming that GR operation with not only sort of simple profiles of who these policymakers are, but the messages that they like to send and where they like to be when it comes to constituent relations, so that you make your GR operation the most effective when it comes to both strategic approaches and tactics. Finally, the last sort of nameless, faceless case study here is the classic one where an industry or a company is coming under attack, which from opposing organizations which seem to have unlimited resources over some sort of public policy issue that's not only stopping the momentum of good public policy from being done, but it's also causing a crisis in your reputation or your brand. I think a lot of what Heather went through is how you put together that a classic opposition research and analysis to be applied to uncover the opposition's motives and to undermine their message. I think what a lot of public affairs campaigns forget to do, though, is to make sure to put together a document of third-party validated facts and figures about why their side of the argument, about both their reputation, the investments that they make, and the good that their industry does, is important to the stakeholders and the constituents of a lot of policymakers within a policymaker's realm, right? And I think it's really important to emphasize the fact that these need to be third-party validated facts. It's not enough for the company to say, we're doing good. A good facts and figures document will have points that are already out there in the public view of reliable sources saying this company or this industry is doing the right thing in advocating for X, Y, and Z. Obviously very important when rebutting opposition arguments at every turn. So at the end of the day, effective winning campaigns is knowing what you don't know and starting from there. There's, I think, too many public affairs campaigns that sort of rely on the gut feeling of someone who's in PR or an old school lobbyist who says, well, I've got experience in this and, we should just do it my way. There needs to be a real deep dive into knowing who exactly your stakeholders are, what your positioning is within that public advocacy issue, and how your issue is being discussed. And with that, we will take your questions.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Matt and Heather. So while folks send in questions, I had a couple to get us started and kick us off. I'm curious, particularly for you all from a more agency contract perspective, when someone does all this, or if you're a more junior employee doing it in-house, you're doing all this research, you have to present it to your boss or someone. How do you kind of digest all of it, share it in a way that's compelling to someone who's more senior, who's not going to necessarily take in all of the mounds of documents and research that you have sifted through?
I think it'd be best, Heather, if you first go through sort of the process, and then I can go through sort of the digestible formats.
Yes, sorry, moment getting off mute there. Yeah, so the most important part about research is understanding the final goal in mind. Research is usually answering a question. So if it's, we have no idea who this group is, who has started being in our space, or we would like to have a press pitch about something, or what is the goal, the final end goal that is in mind. Usually, when you are doing research, it's hard to remember that your viewer has no information about your subject. And so you can take sometimes weeks or months doing something, but recognizing that at the top of your conversation is 3 sentences about the background of what you're looking for. You want to answer that question first and foremost. And I think that sometimes researchers get so caught up in all of the information that's available in the universe that they're not focused on pulling the dots together from a couple of different places in order to have a strategic suggestion for how to move forward, be that from a comms perspective or a government relations perspective. Always going back to that core central question that you are tasked with answering.
Yeah, and to sort of piggyback off of that, it really is about what you want the research eventually to produce. We wish more clients and in the political world, more candidates did this up front. But I consider a vulnerability study on a candidate or on an industry or on a trade association or a company really, really important to do. And oftentimes the final product of a vulnerability study is a very thorough, very prepared, tough Q&A. The vulnerability study produces the questions that the opposition would ask, which then trigger a real conversation among everyone within a trade association or a company or a coalition into a real strategy session about how to answer each of those tough questions in a way that will satisfy the stakeholders that are in play, but also make sure that they get back to the messages that work for them. Another example is message testing, right? You need to figure out which messages are going to work with which audiences. So when you put together both vulnerability analyses and opposition research documents, oftentimes the final product that you'll see up front are different narratives and then polling questions that you would then send to a pollster, where they will ask, based on this research that shows X, Y, and Z, how strongly do you feel positively or negatively about that? But oftentimes, folks just want due diligence about something. And for some of the clients that we have, it's oftentimes, hey, we're about to make this announcement in this particular investment in this industry. We know there's been a lot of controversy about this industry, so we want to know and be prepared for when we announce this investment, what we should expect. And that's more of a tactical research document of, here are the organizations that you should expect to hear from. Here's what they're probably going to say, and here's the most important part. Here are the platforms that they're going to use. Do they like to use Twitter versus doing a Hill event versus having a lot of money to do paid TV and digital ads? And so a lot of, I would say, opposition analyses not only have to do with the messages that they like to use, but the platforms that they also like to employ.
Awesome. Another question that came in, if you bring in researchers, how do you set them up for success, considering that they may not be as deep in the issue and may miss things compared to someone who's in-house and living and breathing that one issue?
So I think there's a huge advantage to have someone. Sorry, I think there's a huge advantage to have somebody who is not enshrined in the issues take a look at it, especially when you're looking at a vulnerability assessment, especially when you're looking to bolster the talking points that these staff have been working with for weeks or months or years. Having an outside perspective allows for new creative ideas, allows you to see some of your accomplishments in a new light, allows someone who is very experienced in a completely different set of public records to identify some detail that might be overlooked, that a stakeholder that you want to persuade holds very dear. The cool thing about political research is that for the last 8 years, I did research in nearly every state in the country, and I was not from those states. And so it is a researcher's job to step into the feet of a voter from that state and to really think about what would matter to a person with this particular background living in this particular place. What is the news that they are consuming? I read that. What are the data points that they are looking at? And to make sure that we are speaking directly to that person exactly where they are.
I'll just add, and I'm sort of taking a look at the list of the clients that I work on, and I'm not going to name them or their issue. But the most important thing when you bring researchers in is to make very clear what your objective is, right? Mm-hmm. It's sometimes the objective is as simple as, hey, I just need to get, sped up on this particular group, this particular lawmaker. I need as much information as possible about what they've said on a particular issue. But just looking at my own client list, right? It's sometimes it's, hey, this opposition group is really bothering us. We need to find a way to disrupt them, and therefore we need to find out everything about them that could cause consternation amongst their donors. Another good example is we lost a state legislative fight last time because of a coalition of a few well-funded people who defeated the piece of legislation that we need passed. We need to figure out not only how to neutralize that opposition, but what kind of allies we need to recruit in order to make sure that we have a majority of both the state House and state Senate to pass this legislation the next time the next legislative session comes about. Another thing that we look at is there's a company that wants to put together a coalition to try to prevent a coming threat to their business model. And that regulation has been proposed for a request for information from a particular federal agency. And this is actually one of the examples that I used in the presentation. They wanted to know, just like, okay, like what is the opposition going to say, but who else can we recruit? And what we found in our analysis of the public comments that were submitted on this particular regulation were not only a bunch of people who were for that nasty regulation, but a bunch of people and organizations that were for it. And after vetting all of those individuals and organizations, we were able to identify which one of these organizations or individuals we could contact to be a part of what would have been a small coalition, but now could be a large coalition.
Awesome. Thank you for answering that. So we have a question. How do we apply this model to contentious topics? The example the person gives is vaccine mandates. Does anything change in your process when things are more heightened?
That's a really good question. When there is a contentious issue at hand, I think it's really important, number one, what your objective is. If your objective is to say, hey, this particular product is a good product, and we want to prevent negative sentiment against this product, it's really important to do the foundational research of sort of the source of that opposition and who that opposition is influenced by. So it's like creating your own stakeholder map of the opposition itself to figure out ways of whether or not they're going to go away. Now, a contentious issue, I will just say this. A contentious issue like the one that was just mentioned, a lot of contentious issues like that where a lot of narrative strategies clients land, I think have to have the upfront realization that the opposition to what you want to do or what you want to promote will always exist, right? They will never go away. They will always use their tactics. And I think the foundational assumption that everyone should have is there are a particular group of people that will always be loud, that will never be turned off, that will always have the resources to push their particular theories or their particular views, and that it's not necessarily the objective of whatever research product you put together to try to stop that group. The objective is to try to disrupt and undermine their credibility with the stakeholders that you're really after. In political campaigns, those being undecided voters. In public affairs campaigns, those being policymakers and those who influence them.
I would piggyback on that with two things. With contentious issues, it's incredibly important to identify as many different buckets of third-party validators that you can think of. With a contentious issue, usually you do not want yourself to be carrying the argument. And so you also will want to think about who is going to be the best messenger for your lines of reasoning. And so you'll want to think about different experts in the industry and how those experts are perceived by both your group, by people in the center, and by the opposing groups. You'll think about things like major newspapers might be something that is important, different statistics coming from different types of studies that you might want to pull together. Brainstorming unlimited numbers of suggestions for how your messaging can break through the noise to the specific audience that you're trying to reach.
Great. And then a last question, unless we get any more that come through. Matt, like you said, sometimes these campaigns can go on for quite a long time. We know there are organizations that fight particular bills or issues for years. What is kind of, if you're working with a client, what's kind of the signal to you that we need to go back to the drawing board, redo some of this research, and revisit our message? And like, how often might you tend to do that?
That's a really good question. I think it would depend on the situation. It's relatively easy to refresh the research if you've just completely failed to pass something that you thought would be easy to pass. There are lots of lessons learned from that, and glean sort of how the opposition was able to sort of quickly dispatch the credibility of your arguments, and for the next time how to at least neutralize that or build the allies that you need in order to do that. I think in these situations where there are sort of long-standing issues in industries that will have constant opposition, I think of the healthcare industry, I think of the energy industry, I think of the financial services industry, all three industries of which we have plenty of clients over here at Narrative Strategies on. As I've said, when the opposition is going to live on forever and you're going to assume that you're just going to have to take their pain from time to time, you have to figure out two things. One is, when are the best moments to neutralize them? And two, how do you deploy the research that you need at the right time to make sure that their arguments, their organizations, the individuals that work for them are also undermined? A key tactical component to this, obviously, many of you probably do clips for your organizations, right? I got to tell you, I see a lot of clips products that are done internally as well as externally that are literally just copy paste jobs of the title of a story, what outlet it came from, and maybe a blurb about sort of where the story came from. I find those clips documents useless. A research-based and a foundationally research-based clips document will provide analysis to each of these articles. Where, like, if someone tweeted about the article that was important, how many followers do they have? Do they have any significant followers? Who's retweeted them? Who has sort of reported on this before? Why is a reporter choosing to use Twitter instead of their own publications platform to do this? All of which to say is that it's so important to do that foundational research, whether it's a vulnerability analysis or an opposition analysis, an analysis overall, an audit of how a discussion is issued, a stakeholder map, so that when you do the clips process, the daily clips process after that, the clips are informed by what you already know. The clips aren't necessarily informing you for the first time of something. Nothing really should be breaking. When you see, for instance, a news article, let's say from, we experienced this yesterday with a particular company who's making a big investment into a really important technology in an important big industry space. We saw an article from an opinion columnist about how all of this is actually just greenwashing, and that nobody should pay attention to this, and this company shouldn't exist, blah, 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 blah. Like that particular clip was of an interesting analysis for us, because we could look back at the foundational research that we did and say, oh, this particular author is connected to this particular organization who is funded by these institutional investors who all have the ulterior motive that have nothing to do with the industry or the issue that's going on. So if folks can, in your organization or your clients, can understand the foundation of what the overall discussion has been in the past. They can read news clips and the analysis that comes along with it, with a particular level of intelligence that then informs the rest of that strategy for at least that day going forward, if not a change in strategy that's more permanent.
Awesome. We got 2 questions while we are discussing that one. So we'll go through these 2 before we wrap up. So the first one comes from Dan. How do you leverage public sentiment on an issue that's moving forward and seems to be a done deal? So the sentiment is going in the opposite direction you want and seems like it's over. What would you do in that situation?
Great question. You have to figure out why public sentiment is going in that direction in the first place. This is, I think, a really important reason why that part of the foundational research that public affairs campaigns do is a basic facts and figures document that's all third-party validated, so that and this is especially important as the foundation specifically for media relations. A reporter isn't just going to believe anything that you have to say because you said it. If you send them backup, if you send them those third-party sources, but put in a way, as Heather put it earlier, put all of that research in a way that creates a narrative that's easy for that reporter to understand, then that could be step 1 in producing a story that pushes back on that negative public sentiment that you're doing. But as you can imagine, the more analysis and the deeper that you go into why a certain issue is moving into that research then can provide a way for you to either to make a strategic decision to either directly combat that negative sentiment in the way that you do it, or give you the knowledge that, you know what, it's time to stop talking about things in the way that the opposition wants us to talk about, and talk about it in the way that we should be talking about it, because we win when we use this language versus the opposition's language. Right. And that's why what Heather mentioned when it came to sort of putting together a message grid based on the research that you do is super, super important. I'm sure Heather has other thoughts on this.
Well, I think you also need to understand the source of the negative public sentiment, right? Is it just something on social media that seems to be going viral? Where did that come from? What is the source of the material? Why does it seem to be going viral? Or are there people in a community or people in another location? What is the pattern between them? Why are these people thinking these things, doing these things, saying these things? And then I think you need to point back to the silent majority. I think that on most issues where you want to get legislation passed or something passed and something starts moving, there's a reason behind it. And so identifying that reason, pointing out what the purposes are behind that reason, and then pointing to the majority of people who believe in your position, but do not nearly have the capacity in their lives to be a vocal supporter or opponent of a measure, I think is an important tactic.
And last question that we got here that you all touched on a little bit, but see if you have anything to expand upon. What would you do if you were going up against a large opponent who funds legislators well? Basically, if you are the underdog resource-wise, what's your approach?
Heather, take it away on this
Well,
one.
it's the opposite, right? It's convincing. It's creating as much noise as possible, and having reporters and public sentiment believe that your Trojan horse is actually a massive mammoth that is going to change the subject. And this is kind of the back and forth. So it would be to be as loud and to try to be everywhere. And the idea of accountability is something that is a key term that small groups use against larger, more well-funded organizations. Trying to hold someone accountable is a narrative that is part of the American experience. And, you know, as I mentioned, all of the public records that are available are here to hold large institutions accountable. And I think that oftentimes small groups will do that against, use that language against larger groups.
I'll give a really good example of this, and I can actually speak publicly about it because this was a campaign that I did way back in 2008 in the state of Alaska. It was a ballot initiative campaign. Someone was trying to, there were a lot of environmental groups who were trying to stop a mine in Alaska. And I was, of course, on the pro-mining side of that ballot initiative. There were, I want to say, about 5 or 6 different groups that were registered with millions of dollars to oppose this particular ballot initiative. And I'm like, this cannot be a coincidence that 6 groups are out there, just happen to have millions of dollars to come after an important part of Alaska's economy. One of my very first research products, I was just a young buck back then, was to essentially do a reverse stakeholder map. And I had a circle that was literally these 5 or 6 organizations. And I looked at all of their public records, who their directors were, what addresses they used, where they seemed to, what vendors they ended up using for their ads, for their websites, etc. And you make all of these different connections to the different consultants they've used, what funding sources that they had. A lot of these 5 organizations ended up funding each other, and it all led to one guy who was a billionaire with a very large cabin in whose backyard was going to be this proposed mine. So while these environmentalists were saying, oh, this mine is terrible, it's going to do terrible things to our environment, what we were able to say is, no, this is just a rich billionaire who's trying to protect his backyard at the expense of creating tens of thousands of jobs in the state, right? And so it's sort of part of this is instinct to see things that are sort of suspicious. But the other is to just do as much digging as possible to make sure that you expose what the true motives are. And that doesn't take millions and billions of dollars. It really just takes a few people with a few good accounts and knowing how to search lobbying records, public records, a lot of the things that Heather mentioned in her part of the presentation.
Researchers are people who are just insatiably curious, who see a couple of data points and identify a pattern and say, I wonder if I pull on this thread, will the whole thing fall apart? I have tried to branch into different strategic communications places, and I keep finding myself curious about what's around the corner, curious about the motives behind something, curious to understand what is actually going on, and to be able to tell that story in a persuasive way.
Awesome. That ballot initiative story, it's like a professional scavenger hunt, like find the X marks the spot. So I think that's an awesome way to end today. Thank you so much for both. Thank you both so much for your time. If folks want to learn more about narrative strategies, the information is there on the screen. If you'd like to learn more about Quorum and some of our data that we have in our platform that can help aid some of this research, build your stakeholder maps of legislators and staff, please reach out to us at quorum.us and look out for your emails as we have more webinars coming up throughout the year. And thanks so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.